"We're just having fun, calm down," she said while I had the engagement ring hidden in my sock drawer. The whole thing started when I came back from my workshop one Tuesday night around 10 p.m., covered in wood stain from restoring a 1967 Gibson Hummingbird that had been water damaged. I'd been working on vintage guitars for 8 years, turning it into a decent business that let me afford our trendy Midtown Sacramento apartment and the lifestyle Brooke seemed to love. She was curled up on our leather couch, the one I'd saved 4 months to buy, giggling at her phone screen like she was watching the funniest video ever made. The blue light was reflecting off her face in this way that made her look almost manic with excitement. I'd noticed this behavior for about 3 weeks now, constant texting, always smiling at her phone, but the moment I walked into a room she'd flip it face down or angle it away from me. When I asked who was so entertaining at this hour, she waved me off with that dismissive little hand gesture she'd developed lately. It was just Alex from her wellness coaching certification program, she explained, and they were discussing some advanced techniques for client motivation and boundary setting. Made sense initially since Brooke had been working hard to build her coaching practice, networking with other professionals and attending weekend seminars about mindful living and personal empowerment. But then I started noticing the pattern. Alex seemed to text her every single night after 9 p.m., right when most professional conversations would be winding down. The messages came in rapid-fire bursts that had her typing furiously for 20 or 30 minutes at a time, and her whole demeanor would shift into this giddy, secretive energy that felt completely different from how she acted when clients or other coaches contacted her during normal hours. I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt because trust had always been important to me, and Brooke had never given me any concrete reason to worry about her loyalty during our 3 years together. We'd built something I thought was solid, shared responsibilities, future plans, the kind of comfortable partnership where we could work on our respective projects while sharing the same space. But something about the way she guarded her phone and the timing of these conversations felt off in a way I couldn't ignore. One night when she fell asleep on the couch with her phone beside her, I saw a notification preview that made my stomach drop. Alex had written something about missing her smile and wishing they could spend more time together outside of their group sessions. That's when I realized these weren't professional development conversations happening every single night, and the casual way she'd been brushing off my concerns suddenly felt calculated rather than innocent. The next morning when I brought up the late-night texting again, she got defensive in a way that confirmed my suspicions. She accused me of being paranoid and controlling, claimed I was trying to sabotage her professional networking because I was jealous of her success in building her coaching business. The way she turned my legitimate concerns into character flaws on my part felt like a practiced deflection, and I started wondering how long she'd been preparing these arguments. I decided to pay closer attention over the next few days, noting when the messages came in and how she responded to them versus how she handled other professional communications. The difference was stark. Alex's texts arrived like clockwork every evening, always generating these private smiles and quick typing sessions, while her actual business contacts got brief, professional responses during normal hours. When I finally pressed her directly about the intimate tone of Alex's messages, she laughed it off and repeated that line about them just having fun, like I was some uptight boyfriend who couldn't handle a little harmless flirtation. But the casual way she dismissed 3 years of our relationship as something that shouldn't interfere with her entertainment made me realize she saw our entire partnership very differently than I did. The engagement ring I'd been saving for over 8 months was sitting in my sock drawer, a princess-cut solitaire that had cost me nearly $6,000, waiting for the right moment to propose at the spot where we'd had our first real conversation about building a future together. Now I was starting to wonder if I'd been planning a proposal while she'd been planning something entirely different with someone else, treating our relationship like it was just another casual connection that didn't require loyalty or commitment. I decided to handle this the same way I approached restoring damaged instruments, methodically, quietly, and without announcing my intentions until the work was complete. Over the next 2 weeks, I began moving my expensive equipment out of our apartment piece by piece while Brooke was at her Tuesday and Thursday wellness coaching sessions downtown. My vintage guitar restoration tools were worth nearly $15,000, accumulated over years of building my business, and I wasn't about to leave them behind in what was clearly becoming a hostile situation. I started with the smaller items, specialized clamps, rare wood stains, Precision measuring tools that most people wouldn't even notice were missing. Then I rented a small storage unit across town and began transferring my larger equipment during her scheduled client meetings, when I knew she'd be gone for at least 3 hours at a time. The irony wasn't lost on me that Brooke's dedication to helping other people set boundaries and find clarity was giving me the perfect window to extract myself from a relationship where she clearly had no boundaries of her own. Our mutual friend Nina helped me coordinate the logistics, and when I mentioned I was looking for a place to rent, she immediately knew of a small craftsman house in East Sacramento that had just become available. Nina worked as a freelance graphic designer and had a network of creative professionals who were always moving around the city, so she heard about housing opportunities before they hit the market. The house had a detached garage that would work perfectly as a workshop, and the rent was actually less than what I'd been paying for my half of our trendy midtown place. Nina seemed relieved when I told her what had been happening with Brooke, and she admitted she'd been wondering about the change in dynamics whenever we all hung out together recently. She'd noticed how Brooke had become increasingly dismissive and distracted, always checking her phone and making little comments about feeling suffocated by serious relationships. What Nina found most telling was how Brooke would complain about me to other people while still expecting me to cover the majority of our shared expenses, from rent to groceries to the subscription services that kept her entertained. Nina had watched this pattern develop over the past few months and was honestly surprised it had taken me this long to recognize what was happening. Our roommate Paige, a freelance graphic designer who rented the third bedroom, started noticing my missing equipment by the second week and asked where I'd moved my larger restoration pieces. When I told her I was reorganizing my workspace, she gave me this knowing look that suggested she understood more than I'd initially realized. Paige revealed that Brooke had been complaining to her for months about feeling trapped by my expectations for commitment and planning, while simultaneously relying on my income from guitar restoration to maintain the lifestyle she wanted in our expensive neighborhood. According to Paige, Brooke had been describing me as controlling and boring to anyone who would listen, even while she was using my steady business income to cover her share of rent when her wellness coaching clients didn't pay on time. The picture Paige painted was of someone who wanted all the benefits of a committed relationship without any of the actual commitment, and who had been building a narrative that justified her behavior by painting me as the problem. I kept my actual plans completely secret from both Brooke and Paige, deciding that the engagement ring sitting in my sock drawer would serve as my final statement about what she'd thrown away while chasing her idea of fun with Alex. Nina helped me secure the craftsman house and even assisted with moving my heavier equipment when Brooke was attending a weekend wellness retreat that she'd been excited about for weeks, mainly because Alex was going to be there as a guest speaker on mindful communication techniques. The weekend Brooke went to her wellness retreat with Alex was when I completed my disappearing act, moving the last of my personal belongings and setting up my final surprise. I'd spent 3 weeks carefully removing every trace of my presence from our shared apartment, and now it was time for the grand finale that would make my position crystal clear. Saturday morning, while she was off learning about mindful communication with the man she'd been texting every night, I took the engagement ring from my sock drawer and placed it in its original Tiffany box, setting it open on our kitchen counter where she'd definitely see it the moment she walked in. Next to the ring box, I left a handwritten note on my letterhead from Garrett's Vintage Guitar Restoration, Professional and Final. The note read exactly what I'd planned to say if she'd been honest with me weeks ago. You wanted fun, not commitment. Have all the fun you want. The ring was going to ruin that anyway. I'd spent considerable time crafting those words to capture both my disappointment and my clarity about what she'd actually chosen, without giving her any ammunition to paint me as the dramatic or emotional one in this situation. After leaving my keys on the counter next to the note and ring, I walked through our apartment one final time to make sure I hadn't missed anything that belonged to me, then locked the door and drove to my new craftsman house in East Sacramento, where Nina was helping me set up my workshop in the detached garage. The timing was perfect because Brooke wouldn't return from her retreat until late Sunday night, giving me a full day to establish my new life before she discovered the old one had completely evaporated. What I didn't anticipate was just how quickly and dramatically she would unravel when she found my message. Nina called me around 11 p.m. Sunday with an update that was both satisfying and slightly alarming. Brooke had been calling and texting everyone in our mutual friend group, oscillating between fury and panic in a way that revealed just how much she'd taken my presence and financial support for granted. According to Nina, Brooke's initial reaction was pure rage about my dramatic overreaction and emotional manipulation, but that anger quickly shifted to genuine panic when she started calculating the financial implications of my departure. She'd been living as if my income was guaranteed, making plans and commitments based on the assumption that I'd continue covering the majority of our shared expenses regardless of how she treated me or our relationship. The reality of suddenly being responsible for her full share of rent, utilities, groceries, and entertainment was apparently hitting her like a freight train loaded with adult responsibilities she'd been avoiding. Nina witnessed Brooke's complete breakdown during an emergency coffee meeting where she'd expected sympathy and support for being abandoned so cruelly and unexpectedly. Instead, Nina found herself listening to Brooke frantically trying to figure out how to cover $1,500 in monthly expenses that she'd assumed would always be my problem. The most telling part of Brooke's meltdown was her repeated insistence that I couldn't actually be serious about leaving over something so trivial as texting another man, because she'd never considered that someone like me would have other options or enough self-respect to walk away from a woman like her. Nina realized that Brooke had built her entire strategy around the assumption that I'd tolerate any behavior as long as she occasionally showed me attention, and she'd never imagined a scenario where I'd simply disappear instead of fighting for her or trying to negotiate better treatment. The engagement ring sitting open on the counter had apparently hit her harder than anything else, because it represented a level of planning and commitment that she'd been completely oblivious to while pursuing her fun with Alex. According to Nina, seeing that ring made Brooke realize she hadn't just lost a boyfriend who paid most of her bills, she'd lost someone who'd been ready to build a permanent life with her, someone who'd been saving and planning for their future while she'd been treating their relationship like entertainment that didn't require any investment on her part. Over the following weeks, Brooke's attempts to reconnect with me became increasingly desperate and contradictory, revealing just how little she understood about the situation she'd created for herself. The first wave of messages came within days of discovering my departure, starting with angry accusations about my selfishness and dramatic overreaction to what she still insisted was harmless fun with Alex. She called me immature and vindictive for leaving without giving her a chance to explain, as if 3 years together hadn't provided ample opportunity for honest communication about what she actually wanted from our relationship. But when those guilt trips failed to generate any response beyond brief, professional acknowledgments, her tone shifted dramatically to pleading requests for help with everything from apartment repairs to covering her share of bills that were suddenly due without my automatic contribution. The irony was absolutely perfect. The same person who'd been complaining about feeling suffocated by my planning and commitment was now frantically asking me to solve problems that my planning had been preventing all along. She needed help coordinating with the landlord about a broken dishwasher, assistance covering her portion of the utility deposits, and advice about managing the household budget that I'd been handling quietly for months while she focused on her wellness coaching and late-night texting sessions. I responded to each request with the same measured professionalism I used with former clients, treating her exactly like the casual acquaintance she'd claimed to prefer during our final confrontation. When she asked for help with apartment maintenance, I provided the landlord's contact information and suggested she handle it directly since we no longer had a shared living arrangement. When she requested financial assistance, I reminded her that people just having fun don't typically split mortgages or coordinate household expenses together. The most telling part of this period was watching Brooke simultaneously post social media content about her liberation from serious relationships while privately begging me to resume the exact responsibilities she'd publicly rejected. Her Instagram stories featured motivational quotes about choosing freedom over security, photos of herself looking carefree and independent, and subtle references to toxic men who try to control strong women through financial manipulation. Meanwhile, she was sending me increasingly frantic text messages about late fees, overdue bills, and unexpected expenses that she'd never had to handle alone during our 3 years together. Nina kept me updated on Brooke's public narrative versus her private reality, and the contrast was absolutely stunning. At coffee dates with mutual friends, Brooke would present herself as someone who'd escaped a suffocating relationship with a controlling man who'd tried to buy her loyalty through financial support. But when she thought no one was listening, she'd complain about how difficult it was to manage adult responsibilities without someone reliable to share the load. She'd apparently started referring to me as her ex-roommate rather than her ex-boyfriend, trying to minimize the significance of what she'd lost while simultaneously mourning the practical benefits of having had a committed partner. The most satisfying moment came when she tried to guilt me about abandoning our shared history together, expecting me to prioritize our past connection over the way she'd treated our relationship in its final months. She sent a long message about how we'd built something meaningful together and how she couldn't understand why I was throwing that away over a misunderstanding about boundaries and communication styles. My response was simple and direct. I reminded her that she'd specifically told me we were just having fun, and that people who were just having fun didn't typically worry about shared histories or abandon connections when those connections stopped being entertaining. I pointed out that her current distress seemed to be focused entirely on the practical inconveniences of my absence rather than any genuine emotional loss, which suggested she'd been more attached to my functions than to me as a person. When she tried to argue that point, I calmly noted that someone who genuinely valued our relationship wouldn't have spent weeks pursuing intimate conversations with another man while dismissing their partner's concerns as paranoia and control issues. The conversation ended with her accusing me of being deliberately cruel and heartless, which I found ironic coming from someone who'd been planning to meet up with Alex behind my back while I was saving for an engagement ring. Nina reported that Brooke had started telling people I was holding grudges and refusing to forgive normal relationship mistakes, but the narrative was falling apart because our mutual friends had witnessed her behavior during the final weeks of our relationship and could see the pattern she'd been following. What I hadn't anticipated was how naturally my friendship with Nina would evolve into something deeper while I was rebuilding my life in the Craftsman house. It started with her helping me design promotional materials for my guitar restoration business, since I'd always handled the craft side while struggling with the marketing and visual presentation that could help me reach more clients. Nina had an eye for showcasing handcrafted work in ways that highlighted both the technical skill and the artistic vision, and she understood how to translate the passion I felt for vintage instrument restoration into compelling content that potential clients could connect with emotionally. We spent hours in my new workshop, with her photographing my restoration process and asking thoughtful questions about the history and significance of each piece I worked on. Unlike Brooke, who'd always seen my workshop time as something that took attention away from her, Nina was genuinely fascinated by the craft and wanted to understand what drew me to this specialized field. She'd sit quietly while I explained the difference between various wood grains or demonstrated how to repair vintage tuning mechanisms, and her questions showed she was actually listening rather than just waiting for me to finish talking about my interests. What struck me most was how our conversations naturally balanced between her graphic design projects and my restoration work, with both of us contributing equally to discussions about creativity, craftsmanship, and building something meaningful rather than just seeking quick entertainment. Nina had been expanding her freelance graphic design business into a full creative studio, and she was looking for a business partner who shared her values about quality work and long-term growth rather than flashy short-term gains. The more we collaborated on my promotional materials, the more we realized our approaches to work and life were remarkably compatible in ways that felt effortless rather than forced. She appreciated my methodical planning and attention to detail, seeing them as assets rather than signs of a controlling personality, while I admired her creative vision and business acumen, which complemented my technical skills perfectly. When Nina suggested we formalize our partnership by launching a creative studio that combined her design work with my restoration services, it felt like a natural evolution of what we'd already been building together. We spent weeks developing a business plan that played to both our strengths, with her handling client relations and visual branding while I managed the technical restoration work and project planning that ensured we could deliver consistent quality on schedule. The financial investment was split equally between us, with Nina contributing her existing client base and design equipment while I brought my restoration tools and the workshop space in my detached garage. For the first time in years, I was working with someone who matched my contribution level instead of expecting me to carry the majority of the responsibility while they focused on more entertaining pursuits. Our personal relationship developed alongside our business partnership, growing out of shared late-night planning sessions and the comfortable intimacy that comes from working toward common goals with someone who respects your efforts. There was no drama, no games, no testing to see how much I'd tolerate before standing up for myself. Nina valued the same things I did: building something lasting, treating partners with respect, and investing equally in shared ventures whether they were professional or personal. When Brooke discovered through social media that Nina and I were not only in business together but also romantically involved, her reaction was both predictable and revealing. She immediately accused me of having planned this betrayal all along, suggesting that I'd been secretly pursuing Nina while pretending to be committed to our relationship. The accusation was so far off base that it was almost amusing, especially coming from someone who'd been conducting her own secret emotional affair for weeks before I left. When I pointed out that she'd never defined our relationship as exclusive anyway, since we were apparently just having fun rather than building something serious, she couldn't respond without contradicting her own previous statements about wanting freedom and casual connections. Nina handled Brooke's accusations with impressive calm, simply noting that our relationship had developed naturally after my departure and that she found it ironic to be criticized for building something honest and equal by someone who'd been hiding intimate communications with another man from their supposed partner. The contrast between how Nina approached relationships and how Brooke had was becoming obvious to everyone in our social circle, with several mutual friends commenting privately about how much more grounded and genuinely happy I seemed since moving on from the chaos and uncertainty that had characterized my final months with Brooke. Meanwhile, Brooke's life was unraveling in ways that were both predictable and satisfying to witness from a distance. Without my steady income from guitar restoration to subsidize her lifestyle, she was forced to find roommates to help cover the expensive Midtown apartment rent. But her track record with reliable people was apparently as poor as her judgment in romantic relationships. Nina kept me updated on the revolving door of roommates who either couldn't pay their share of expenses or created enough drama to drive away other potential tenants, leaving Brooke constantly scrambling to find new people willing to deal with her increasingly chaotic living situation. The first replacement roommate was some guy from her wellness coaching network who seemed responsible initially but turned out to be unreliable about basic things like cleaning common areas and paying utilities on time. When Brooke tried to confront him about his share of responsibilities, he accused her of being controlling and moved out after 6 weeks, leaving her on the hook for his portion of the lease. The second roommate was a woman who seemed more promising until she started bringing random dates home at all hours and left the apartment in such consistently poor condition that Brooke couldn't bring friends over without embarrassment. The pattern continued for months, with Brooke attracting people who were either financially unreliable or personally problematic, while anyone responsible enough to be a good roommate recognized her red flags and found housing elsewhere. The stress of constantly managing problematic living situations was apparently affecting her wellness coaching business as well, since potential clients could sense the chaos in her personal life and questioned whether she was qualified to help them create balance and clarity in their own lives. Nina mentioned hearing through mutual contacts that Brooke had been losing clients who'd initially been excited to work with her but became concerned when she started canceling sessions due to roommate emergencies or apartment crises that she couldn't handle independently. Her social media presence shifted from motivational wellness content to increasingly desperate posts about the challenges of finding good people and dealing with others who didn't share her values about respect and responsibility. The irony was absolutely perfect, considering she'd spent months complaining to anyone who'd listen about my expectations for planning and commitment while now struggling to find anyone willing to commit to basic apartment sharing agreements. Her relationship with Alex had also fizzled out in exactly the way I'd predicted it would once she needed actual support rather than just entertaining conversation. According to Nina, Alex had been fine with their late-night texting sessions and the excitement of pursuing someone who was technically unavailable, but he disappeared quickly when Brooke started expecting him to help solve the practical problems created by my departure. Apparently he'd been looking for fun and validation, not a girlfriend with financial stress and housing instability who needed emotional support rather than just flirtation. The man she'd thrown away a 3-year committed relationship for turned out to be exactly as shallow and uncommitted as his behavior had suggested from the beginning. What made the situation even more satisfying was watching Brooke cycle through other potential romantic partners who were either intimidated by her obvious desperation or attracted only to her appearance without any interest in dealing with the drama that followed her everywhere. Nina reported that Brooke had been complaining to mutual friends about the poor quality of men available in Sacramento, apparently oblivious to the fact that her own behavior and circumstances were the common factor in all her failed connections. Meanwhile, my life with Nina was flourishing in ways that highlighted just how toxic and draining my final months with Brooke had actually been. Our creative studio was attracting clients who appreciated both the quality of my restoration work and Nina's marketing expertise, allowing us to expand into custom guitar design and vintage instrument consultation services. We were making more money together than I'd ever made alone, while splitting all expenses equally and building toward long-term goals that we'd planned together rather than goals I'd developed alone, while hoping my partner would eventually show interest. Our friends consistently commented on how natural and supportive our relationship appeared, with both of us contributing equally to conversations and decisions rather than one person dominating while the other provided financial or emotional support without reciprocation. Nina and I were talking about buying a house together by the end of the year, something that felt exciting and achievable rather than like a burden I'd be carrying alone, while hoping my partner would eventually appreciate the stability I was trying to provide. 18 months after I'd left that engagement ring on the kitchen counter, Nina and I reached a milestone that would trigger Brooke's complete psychological breakdown and force her to confront the full magnitude of what she'd destroyed while chasing shallow thrills with Alex. We'd been discussing marriage for months, but I wanted to make sure I was proposing for the right reasons this time, because I'd found someone who genuinely wanted to build a life with me, not because I was trying to convince someone to value what I had to offer. When Nina and I discovered we were expecting our first child, the engagement happened naturally as part of planning our future together, and I finally got to use that ring-buying experience productively by choosing something that represented our actual relationship rather than my hopes about what someone else might eventually appreciate. The pregnancy announcement we posted on social media was simple and heartfelt, showing our joined hands with Nina's engagement ring and a photo of the ultrasound, with a caption about how excited we were to start this next chapter together. Within hours, friends and family were congratulating us on both the engagement and the baby news, celebrating what everyone could see was a healthy relationship between two people who'd found exactly what they'd been looking for in each other. What I didn't anticipate was that this announcement would reach Brooke during the worst week of her downward spiral, creating a perfect storm of realization about everything she'd lost while pursuing entertainment over commitment. According to Nina, who heard the details through our friend network, Brooke had finally been forced to move back in with her parents after her wellness coaching business collapsed completely due to her inability to maintain professional stability while managing her chaotic personal life. The same week our pregnancy announcement went live, Brooke was packing up the Midtown apartment she could no longer afford, having burned through multiple roommates and lost most of her client base to competitors who could offer the consistency and reliability she'd never learned to provide. Nina reported that Brooke had seen our announcement while sitting in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by boxes of belongings she'd had to relocate after losing the independent adult life she'd taken for granted during our relationship. The combination of seeing me engaged to someone else, expecting a child, and obviously thriving both personally and professionally while she was moving backward into dependence on her parents apparently triggered a complete meltdown that lasted several days. She'd immediately started calling mutual friends, demanding to know how long Nina and I had been together and whether we'd been involved before my relationship with her ended, as if the timeline of our romance was somehow more important than addressing her own role in destroying what she'd had with me. When people tried to point out that she'd been the one who chose Alex over me and had specifically said she wanted fun rather than commitment, she became increasingly agitated and defensive about being blamed for natural relationship evolution and personal growth. The most revealing part of Brooke's reaction was her repeated insistence that Nina had somehow stolen the life that should have belonged to her, as if my happiness and success were resources that had been unfairly redistributed rather than the natural result of finding someone who shared my values and goals. She apparently couldn't understand that my contentment with Nina wasn't about revenge or proving a point, but about finally being with someone who appreciated stability, planning, and mutual investment instead of finding those qualities suffocating and controlling. 2 weeks after our announcement, Brooke showed up uninvited to a mutual friend's birthday gathering where she knew Nina and I would be present, clearly planning some kind of confrontation that would allow her to express her feelings about our relationship and the unfairness of how things had worked out. The moment she saw us together, with Nina obviously pregnant and both of us radiating the kind of comfortable happiness that comes from being with the right person, something inside her seemed to snap completely. She approached us during a quiet moment and launched into this speech about how we'd stolen her life and destroyed her future by building our relationship on the foundation of her heartbreak and my vindictive desire to hurt her for choosing someone else. Nina handled the situation with remarkable grace, calmly pointing out that Brooke had made her choices freely and that our happiness wasn't built on anyone else's misery, but on our shared commitment to creating something meaningful together while she'd been focused on avoiding exactly that kind of responsibility. When Brooke started crying and talking about how she'd never meant to hurt anyone and had just been scared of the serious direction our relationship was heading, Nina delivered the final blow by revealing that I'd actually bought her engagement ring 2 years earlier, long before Brooke started her texting affair with Alex, and that we'd been planning our future together while she'd been actively working to undermine it in favor of something more entertaining and less demanding. The revelation that I'd been ready to propose long before Alex appeared in our lives, and that her behavior had prevented her from receiving the exact commitment she was now mourning, seemed to break something fundamental in how Brooke understood her own choices and their consequences.